The dust, a fine red powder, settled on everything. On the cracked porch boards, on the rusting pump handle, on the stiff, unyielding leaves of the corn stalks that had given up aspiring to any height weeks ago. It settled on Ilara's hands, worked into the lines of her palms, a permanent grime that water only thinned, never truly washed away. 3 years. 3 years the dust had been her most constant companion, more faithful than the rain, more present than the memory of Jonah's laughter. That memory was a wisp now, thin as a spider's thread in a high corner, easily broken. She didn't try to catch it anymore. The farm was a map of their shared life, now faded, its landmarks obscured. The well he dug, deeper than any man before him dared, now grudgingly offered water tasting of earth and sorrow. The barn, its great doors groaning like an old man's complaint, stood half empty, a hollow chest where a heart once beat strong with the rhythm of livestock and purpose. She moved through her chores with a practiced economy, a body remembering what the spirit had tried to forget. Feed the chickens, their clucking a dull, repetitive sound against the vast silence. Check the fences, a task that felt more like outlining her own solitude than protecting any real asset. The sun beat down, a hammer on an anvil, forging the day into a shape of heat and resignation. Tonight it bled across the horizon in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, a painter's reckless abandon. Ilara stood by the western fence line, her hand resting on a weathered post, feeling the splinters catch her skin. The air was still, holding its breath before the cool sigh of evening. That's when she saw them, a shape, then two, huddled against the base of the fence, as if seeking an anchor in the desolate expanse. The last light caught them, casting long, distorted shadows that flickered like dying flames. One was a man, slumped, head bowed, a discarded puppet whose strings had been cut. The other, smaller, a boy, crouched beside him, a silhouette of fear. She didn't move. Her first thought was of trouble, a word that tasted as bitter as the well water. Trouble came in many forms out here: desperation, sickness, the law. Usually it passed her by, her little patch of barrenness too uninviting. But this felt different, closer. She approached slowly, her boots making soft thuds in the dust. The only sound. The man didn't stir. The boy's head snapped up, his eyes wide, luminous in the dimming light, like a nocturnal creature caught in a sudden glare. He was small, perhaps 7, 8 years, thin. His clothes were torn, caked with the same red dust that claimed her farm. The man groaned, a low guttural sound. Sunburnt, she thought, or fever. His face, when she got closer, was a mask of cracked leather and exhaustion. A preacher, perhaps, by the worn black coat, impossibly hot for this season, clinging to him like a second unwanted skin, or just a man who'd lost his way and his hope. Ilara knelt. "Water," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, from the dust. It wasn't a question. The boy flinched but didn't run. He looked from her to the man, his small face a canvas of anxiety. She went back to the house, the screen door sighing shut behind her. The dipper clanked against the bucket. The water was cool, a fleeting blessing. She carried it back, a small offering in a chipped enamel cup. The boy watched her every move. She offered it to the man first. His hand trembled as he reached, his fingers brushing hers, dry and hot. He drank, spilling some down his chin, the water tracing clean paths through the grime. Then she offered it to the boy. He took the cup in both hands, drank slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "He's sick," she stated, more to herself than to the boy. The man coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Barn," she said, gesturing. "Hay's clean." It was more than she'd offered anyone in 3 years, more than she thought she had left to give. The boy understood. He tried to pull the man up, his small frame straining. Ilara hesitated for a moment, a beat of her old guarded heart, then bent and helped. The man was heavier than he looked, a dead weight. Together, they half dragged, half carried him towards the looming darkness of the barn. The air inside was cooler, smelling of old hay and forgotten seasons. She pointed to a pile in the cleanest corner. There, they settled him. The boy hovered. "He'll be gone by morning," she told herself, retreating from the barn, from the faint scent of sickness and unspoken stories. "They'll both be gone." But the words felt hollow, lost in the vast encroaching night, swallowed by a silence that suddenly felt less empty, more expectant. The crickets began their nightly chorus, a sound that usually lulled her into a restless sleep. Tonight, it felt like a prelude. She sat on the porch, the darkness wrapping around her, the distant stars cold and indifferent. A single lamp burned in her window, a small, defiant speck against the immense black. She thought of Jonah, a fleeting, painful image. He'd never have turned them away. But Jonah was gone. And she was not Jonah, or so she believed. The first light was a hesitant smear of gray when Alara woke, the familiar ache in her back a reminder of the hard cot and harder years. Her first conscious thought, unbidden, was of the barn, of them. She'd expected the silence of their departure, the faint indentation in the hay the only sign they'd ever been. Instead, a different silence held the morning, one punctuated by the soft rustle of hay, the almost inaudible breath of sleeping men, or a man and a boy. She moved with her usual quiet, tending the stove, the clink of the coffee pot unnaturally loud in her own ears. They would need food, if they were still here. If the man was able, the thought was an intrusion, unwelcome. Her charity had a limit, a boundary defined by a single night, a cup of water, a pile of hay. Daylight would see them on their way, surely. When she stepped onto the porch, the air was cool, carrying the scent of dew and dust. The barn door was ajar, a dark slit in the weathered wood. And there, sitting on the edge of the porch, legs dangling, was the boy. He wasn't looking at her, but out towards the parched fields, his small shoulders slumped. He wore the same torn clothes, his hair matted. He looked like a misplaced shadow, waiting for the sun to give him form. He turned as she approached, his eyes, those same luminous, watchful eyes from the night before, fixing on her. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just watched. "Morning," Alara said, the word feeling stiff in her mouth. He nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. She went to the pump, the rhythmic squeak and groan a familiar song. As she carried the bucket back, he was still there, unmoving. "Your pa?" she asked, gesturing towards the barn. The boy's gaze flickered to the barn, then back to her. Sleeping. His voice was soft, surprisingly clear, like a small smooth stone found in a dry riverbed. Alara took a breath. "When he wakes, you'll need to be moving on." The words were necessary, firm. She had her own life, her own emptiness to manage. She couldn't take on theirs. The boy looked down at his dusty feet. He didn't argue, didn't plead. His silence was a heavier weight than any protest. Inside, the preacher, Elias, was still asleep, his breathing shallow but more regular than the night before. His face, in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the barn wall, was deeply lined. A roadmap of hardship. A worn leather satchel lay beside him, its contents a mystery. She left a piece of bread and a cup of water near him, then retreated. The boy was still on the porch when she returned to the house. He hadn't touched the food she'd silently offered, a piece of leftover cornbread. He simply watched her. As she moved about her morning chores, feeding the chickens, checking the meager garden, she felt his eyes on her, a constant, silent presence. It reminded her of the way a stray dog, once fed, will attach itself, a hopeful, heartbreaking loyalty in its gaze. Jonah had brought home such a dog once. A scruffy terrier mix, all bones and matted fur. He'd named it Lucky, a bitter irony, considering. Lucky had stayed for 5 years, loyal to the end, until the same fever that took half the town's livestock took him too. She pushed the memory away. This boy was not a stray dog. And she was not offering a home. Later, as she mended a split rail in the corral fence, the boy appeared at her elbow. He held out a fallen hammer, his small hand surprisingly steady. She hadn't even realized she'd dropped it. "Thanks," she mumbled, taking it from him, their fingers brushing. His skin was cool. She expected him to retreat, but he stayed, watching her work, his expression unreadable. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning coolness. The preacher still hadn't emerged. Alara found herself glancing towards the barn more often than she liked. A strange rhythm began to impose itself. Her solitude, usually a solid, unbroken thing, now had a small, silent satellite orbiting its edges. The chores felt different, observed. The silence felt different, shared. She remembered Jonah, not his laughter this time, but his hands. Strong, capable hands, mending this very fence, his brow furrowed in concentration. He'd look up, see her watching, and a slow smile would spread across his face. A smile that promised warmth, safety. A promise broken by the river or by the road. She never knew which. The whispers in town had favored the road. A man like Jonah, they'd said, too full of life to be truly gone, just gone elsewhere. She'd learned to ignore the whispers. Now, new whispers might start. A woman alone, taking in strangers. A boy. A sick man. The thought tightened something in her chest. They had to leave. Soon. Days bled into one another, measured not by the calendar, which she'd stopped turning 3 years ago, but by the slow arc of the sun and the gradual strengthening of the man in the barn. Elias, the preacher, for that's what he was, his worn Bible a constant companion once he was strong enough to hold it, said little of his past, nothing of what drove him and the boy, Silas, to her fence line. He spoke in parables when he spoke at all, his voice still raspy but gaining a quiet authority that seemed out of place amidst the dust and decay of her farm. He'd sit in the sliver of shade by the barn door, the Bible open on his lap, not always reading, sometimes just looking out at the heat-shimmering land. His eyes filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to drink the light. Silas was a shadow turned solid. He no longer just watched, he followed. When Alara went to the chicken coop, he was there, scattering feed with a seriousness that belied his age. When she weeded the stubborn sprouts in her vegetable patch, he knelt beside her, pulling with a surprising diligence, his small hands mimicking hers. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant hum beneath the surface of her days. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch steps, darning a worn shirt, one of Jonah's, too threadbare to wear but too full of ghosts to discard, Silas approached. He held something out to her on his dusty palm. A feather, not a common chicken feather, but a hawk's feather, barred brown and white, perfect and unbroken. "Found it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "by the creek bed, the dry creek bed, where hope for water went to die each summer." She looked at the feather, then at his expectant face. His eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of something other than watchfulness, a hesitant offering. She took it. It was light, yet felt substantial in her calloused hand. "It's a good one," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He nodded, a small, satisfied dip of his chin, and then, as if her acceptance was a signal, he sat beside her on the steps, not too close, but within the circle of her presence. He didn't speak again, just sat companionably silent as she continued her mending. The needle dipped and rose, a tiny silver fish swimming through faded blue cloth. She could feel the warmth of him beside her, a small sun. The town, distant as it was, wasn't blind. Old Man Hemlock, who rode his dilapidated wagon past her property once a week on his way to deliver his meager clutch of eggs, had seen them. His eyes, milky with age but missing nothing, had lingered on the boy, on the dark figure of the preacher. He hadn't stopped, hadn't spoken, but Alara knew. The news would travel, carried on the dry wind, embellished with each telling. She remembered the looks after Jonah disappeared. Pity, at first. Then, suspicion. Had she driven him away? Did she know more than she let on? Mrs. Gable, whose tongue was sharper than any scythe, had hinted that a woman alone, with a farm too big for her, might find ways to cope. The insinuations had stung, then hardened her. She'd retreated further into herself, the farm her fortress. Now, the fortress had guests, uninvited, yet undeniably present. Elias, when he had more strength, began to help with small repairs. a loose shutter, a wobbly porch rail. He worked with a quiet competence, his movements economical, like a man used to making do with little. He never asked for anything, yet seemed to anticipate needs. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in those same bruised colors, he found Ilara staring at the ramshackle chicken coop, its door hanging by a single hinge. "A nail, a piece of wire," he said, his voice quiet beside her. "It can be mended." She nodded, not looking at him. "Everything can," he added, softer still. "Or at least, held together for a while longer." Was he talking about the coop, or something else entirely? With Elias, it was hard to tell. His words were like seeds, dropped into the soil of her thoughts, taking root in unexpected ways. The presence of the preacher and the boy was changing the landscape of her days, subtly, irrevocably. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the barren silence of absence. It was a silence of waiting, of watching, of becoming. The word, when it came, was as soft and unexpected as a puff of dandelion seed landing on her sleeve. "Ma!" Silas stood beside her, holding out a chipped clay marble he'd unearthed near the old well. Ilara was kneading dough, her hands floured, her mind miles away, tangled in thoughts of dwindling supplies and the ever-present dust. She paused, her knuckles deep in the yielding mass. "What did you say?" He looked down at the marble, then up at her, his gaze unwavering. "Ma." Not a question, a statement, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she had always been, or was always meant to be. A tremor went through her, a shock that vibrated from her floured hands to the very core of her. Her breath caught. No one had called her that, ever. She and Jonah, they had hoped. Oh, how they had hoped. Month after month, year after year, the hope had dwindled, replaced by a quiet ache, a space in her heart that had remained stubbornly, painfully empty. Now this boy, this stranger's child, dropped the word into that space, like a stone into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards, unsettling everything. "I'm not," she began, then stopped. What was she not? His mother? Clearly. But the word he used wasn't just a label. It was a claim, a need. She saw Elias then, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his dark eyes watching them. He said nothing, his expression unreadable, but his presence amplified the intensity of the moment. He was a silent witness to this fragile, impossible bridge being built between a lost boy and a woman who had lost herself. Ilara turned back to the dough, her movements jerky, unsure. Your father is in the barn, Silas." Using his name felt deliberate, a reassertion of boundaries. But the boy didn't flinch. He simply placed the marble on the edge of the flour-dusted counter, a small, round offering. Then he slipped away, silent as he'd come. The air in the kitchen felt thick, charged. She punched the dough harder than necessary. "Ma." The word echoed. It conjured images she had long suppressed. Tiny hands, lullabies whispered in the dark, the specific weight of a sleeping child in her arms, dreams that had turned to ghosts. She glanced at the marble. Such a small thing, yet it felt monumental. Later that day they worked on the porch together. Not her and Silas, but her and Elias. Silas sat on the steps, watching, occasionally fetching a tool or a stray nail. Elias was surprisingly skilled with his hands, his movements precise despite a lingering weakness. They didn't speak much. The scrape of a saw, the tap of a hammer, filled the silence. But it was a working silence, a silence of shared purpose. She found herself watching Elias's hands. They were long-fingered, scarred, the knuckles prominent. Hands that had held a Bible, yes, but also, she suspected, tools, perhaps even a weapon. There was a story in those hands, a story he wasn't telling. As they worked, a dry wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain, a promise rarely kept in these parts. It whipped Ilara's hair around her face, tugged at her skirt. Silas shivered, though the air was still warm. "Storm's coming," Elias said, looking towards the bruised western sky. Not a preacher's pronouncement, but a farmer's observation. Ilara nodded. Storms here were often sudden, violent, tearing through the land with a brief fury before moving on, leaving behind a deceptive calm and a deeper thirst, like trouble, like the past. That night, she lay on her cot, the sound of the rising wind a restless sigh around the small house. Ma. The word was a burr, clinging to her thoughts. She thought of her own mother, a woman whose face was a faded photograph in her mind, whose hands had been rough from work but gentle in their touch. She had been Ma to Alara for too short a time. The emptiness Silas carried, the one that made him reach for that word, she understood it. It was a mirror to her own. She clutched the hawk feather Silas had given her. It was hidden in the small wooden box where she kept Jonah's wedding band and a few dried wildflowers from a happier spring. A small collection of precious things. The feather felt like a question and a possibility. The whispers found their way to her doorstep on the back of Mrs. Henderson's rattling buckboard. She'd come ostensibly for eggs, though Alara had few to spare and Mrs. Henderson lived miles in the other direction from town. Her eyes, small and sharp like a bird's, darted around the yard, taking in the mended porch rail, the figure of Elias sitting in the shade of the barn, Silas trailing Alara like a devoted gosling. "Heard you had visitors," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice laced with a sweetness that didn't quite mask the curiosity or the judgment. Alara kept her face neutral, her hands busy wiping down the already clean counter where she'd placed the meager offering of 3 eggs. A preacher man needed rest. And the boy? Her gaze flickered toward Silas, who had retreated to the edge of the porch, his small back to them. With him, Alara's tone was clipped, discouraging further inquiry. But Mrs. Henderson was not easily discouraged. "Folks are saying things, Alara. You know how it is. A woman alone." Her eyes slid meaningfully towards the barn again. "Some say that preacher, he might be running from something. And the boy, well, where's his kin?" Alara felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest. The town, their eyes, their tongues, always ready to pick apart a life that didn't fit their narrow expectations. "He was sick, Martha. I gave him shelter. That's all. Shelter can turn into other things." Mrs. Henderson finally picked up the eggs, her gaze lingering on Alara's face. "Just be careful, dear. Jonah wouldn't have wanted you mixed up in trouble." The mention of Jonah was a deliberate prod. Alara's jaw tightened. "Jonah isn't here." The words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. After Mrs. Henderson left, a cloud of dust and unspoken warnings in her wake, Alara felt a surge of defiance. It wasn't just for herself anymore. It was for the quiet man in the barn who read his Bible and mended her fences. It was for the boy who called her Ma, who left her small treasures of feathers and marbles. They were hers to protect, in some strange, undefined way. Or perhaps she was theirs. Elias seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. He became even quieter, his eyes more watchful. He spent more time with the Bible, but Alara sometimes saw him staring out at the road, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. He began teaching Silas to read, using the worn pages of his Bible. Their heads would be bent together in the shade. Elias's deep voice, a low murmur. Silas's small finger tracing the words. It was a peaceful scene, yet Alara felt an undercurrent of urgency, as if time was running out. One evening, as a blood-red sunset bled across the sky, mirroring the one on the night they arrived, Alara found Silas sitting alone by the well, throwing small pebbles into its dark mouth. He looked up as she approached, his face troubled. "Are we bad people, Ma?" he asked. The question so direct, so innocent, it pierced her. She sat beside him on the cool stone lip of the well. "Why would you say that, Silas?" "The lady, Mrs. Henderson, she looked at us like we were." Alara put an arm around his thin shoulders. He leaned into her, a small, trusting weight. "People look at things they don't understand in all sorts of ways, Silas. It doesn't make them right. Is Preacher Elias running from something bad?" She hesitated. This was the question that echoed in her own mind. Sometimes, Silas, people run because they're scared, or because they're trying to protect someone, like she was trying to protect them now. He was silent for a moment. Then he burrowed closer. "I'm glad we found your barn." Her arm tightened around him. Me too, Silas, she whispered, the admission surprising even herself. The whispers were a precursor to the storm, she knew. And the storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the two still evenings, in the way the shadows stretched longer and darker each day. Ilara found the boy by the creek bed, not the dry, dusty one near the house, but the one further out, where a trickle of muddy water still stubbornly flowed, nourishing a thin line of willows. He was trying to build a dam with stones and twigs, a small, earnest architect against the indifferent flow. She sat on the bank, watching him. His concentration was absolute, his small brow furrowed. Silas, she said gently, after a while. He looked up, his hands muddy, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. Why do you call me that? She asked. The question that had been hovering unspoken between them since he'd first uttered the word. He didn't answer immediately. He picked up a flat stone, weighed it in his palm, then carefully placed it on his precarious dam. "'Cause you are," he said finally, without looking at her. Simple, undeniable. In his world, in his heart, it was the truth. Ilara felt a warmth spread through her, a fragile bloom in the arid landscape of her emotions. She didn't correct him. She couldn't. Later that evening, as the preacher, Elias, mended a harness strap by the light of a flickering lantern in the barn, Ilara approached him. The air was heavy, charged with the unspoken. The crickets chirped, a nervous, insistent sound. "Elias," she began, her voice low, "what are you running from?" He stopped his work, the awl poised in his hand. He looked at her, his face shadowed, his eyes deep-set and weary. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, taut as the leather strap in his hands. "Does it matter?" he asked finally, his voice rough. "To you? It matters if it brings trouble to this boy." Her gaze was steady. His eyes softened, just for an instant. "I would never bring him to harm, Ilara. Everything I do is to keep him from it." "Harm from who? Or what?" he sighed. A sound like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. "There are men who believe justice is a hammer, and every problem a nail. Men who twist words, even holy ones, to serve their own darkness." He looked down at his hands. "I spoke out against such men, against their greed, their cruelty. They did not appreciate the sermon. A fugitive then, not from the law perhaps, but from a lawless kind of power." "And Silas?" "His mother, she trusted him to me. Before she was taken by the fever that swept through our camp, she knew they would come for me. She made me promise." His voice was raw, with a pain that resonated with Ilara's own hidden griefs. He was not just a preacher running from persecution. He was a guardian, a promise keeper. The revelation settled something in Ilara, but also heightened her anxiety. These men, the ones Elias spoke of, they wouldn't give up easily. The wind began to howl then, a mournful sound that rattled the loose boards of the barn. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, angry black. Lightning split the darkness, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Silas, who had been asleep on his pallet of hay, cried out. Ilara was by his side in an instant, her hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, Silas. Just a storm." He clung to her, trembling. Elias watched them, his face a mask of sorrow and a fierce, protective light. The storm raged around them, a symphony of wind and rain and thunder. It felt like the world outside was tearing itself apart. Inside the barn, in the small circle of lantern light, 3 figures huddled together, a fragile island in a sea of chaos. Ilara remembered another storm. Years ago, Jonah had been caught out in it, mending a fence line far from the house. She'd waited, frantic, watching the lightning illuminate the terrifying, empty landscape. He'd come back soaked, laughing, pulling her into a cold, wet embrace that had promised her he'd always come back, a promise the river, or the road, had swallowed. Now, another storm, another kind of fear. But this time, she wasn't alone in her waiting. She held Silas close, his small body a warm, solid presence against hers. The fear was still there, but it was different. It was a fear for them, not just for herself. And in that fear, there was a strange, fierce strength. The riders appeared as the last vestiges of the storm retreated, leaving behind a washed, wounded world. They came not on the main road, but across the fields, 3 dark figures against the bruised dawn sky, their horses picking their way through the muddy furrows. Elara saw them first. From the kitchen window, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. Law badges. Hard eyes. She'd known this was coming. The whispers, the storm, Elias's haunted gaze. It had all been a prelude. "Elias!" she called, her voice low but urgent. He was in the barn, checking for damage. Silas was with her, trying to coax a wet, disgruntled chicken back into its coop. The boy looked up, his eyes wide, sensing the change in her. Elias emerged from the barn, his face grim. He'd seen them too. "Inside, Silas," Elara said, her hand on his shoulder guiding him towards the house. "Stay with Elias." She walked out onto the porch, her bare feet cold on the damp wood. She stood straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, waiting. She would meet them on her terms, on her land. They reined in their horses a few feet from the porch, the animals snorting, their flanks steaming in the cool morning air. The leader, a burly man with a weathered face and eyes like chips of flint, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Morning, ma'am. Name's Sheriff Brody. This here's Deputy Miller and Deputy Carson." Elara nodded. "Sheriff." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "Looking for a man," Brody said, his gaze sweeping past her, towards the barn, then the house. "Preacher, they say. Goes by Elias. And a boy with him." "There's a preacher here," Elara said, her tone even. "He was unwell. I offered him shelter." "Unwell?" Miller, younger, with a nervous energy, shifted in his saddle. "Or on the run?" Brody's eyes narrowed. "We have reason to believe he's a fugitive, inciting unrest, theft, maybe worse. And the boy, we hear he might be stolen." The words hung in the damp air, ugly and heavy. Stolen. Elara thought of Silas's small hand in hers, the way he called her Ma. "The boy is his ward," she said, her voice firm. "His mother passed. The preacher is caring for him." "That what he told you?" Brody's lip curled slightly. "These types, they tell all sorts of stories to sympathetic women." Sympathetic? As if her compassion was a weakness they could exploit. Anger, cold and sharp, pricked at her. From the corner of her eye she saw movement at the barn door. Elias. He stepped out, Silas clinging to his leg, half hidden behind him. The boy's face was pale, his eyes huge. Brody's gaze locked onto Elias. "Well, well, speak of the devil." He swung down from his horse, the deputies following suit. They moved with a predatory confidence, their hands near their holstered guns. "Elias Thorne, we've been looking for you a long time." Elias stood his ground, his hand resting protectively on Silas's head. "I am here, Sheriff, but you are mistaken. I have stolen nothing. I have incited no one to violence, only to truth." "Truth?" Brody snorted. "Your kind of truth stirs up trouble. And this boy." He gestured toward Silas. "Where'd you get him, Thorne? What happened to his real folks?" Silas whimpered, pressing closer to Elias. Elara saw the fear in the preacher's eyes, but also a stubborn resolve. She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly between the lawmen and the two by the barn. "Sheriff," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "this man and boy were near death when I found them. I gave them water, food, a place to rest. Whatever else they are under my roof." Brody turned his flinty gaze on her. "Ma'am, harboring a fugitive is a serious offense, and if that boy ain't his by right, you're an accomplice to kidnapping." The words were a threat, stark and brutal. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. The truth the world wants, she thought, and the family fate gave her. She looked at Silas, his small, terrified face. She looked at Elias, his quiet dignity in the face of accusation. The farm, her fortress of solitude, had suddenly become a battleground, and she was its only defender. The choice was before her, sharp as a shard of broken glass. Sheriff Brody took a step closer to Elara, his shadow falling over her. "Ma'am, we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Just tell us what you know. Is he Thorne? Is that boy his?" His voice was deceptively calm, the way a predator's is before it strikes. Elara looked past him, to where Elias stood, Silas now almost fully behind him, peeking out with one frightened eye. She saw not a fugitive preacher, but a man who mended fences and taught a lost boy to read. She saw not a stolen child, but a boy who had unearthed a forgotten tenderness in her, who called her Ma, with an innocent conviction that had reshaped her world, the truth the world wanted. It was a narrow, barren thing, like the dust that choked her fields. It offered no shelter, no warmth. Fate, or something like it, had brought these two souls to her door, battered and afraid. They had, in their quiet way, brought life back to the silent corners of her existence. She thought of Jonah. What would he have done? He would have stood for what was right, what was human. He wouldn't have fed them to the wolves, no matter the cost. And in that moment, she knew she was more like Jonah than she had allowed herself to believe for 3 long years. She met Brody's gaze, her own surprisingly steady. His name is Elias. The boy is Silas. They were in need. I helped them. That's not an answer, ma'am. Brody's patience was wearing thin. His hand drifted closer to the butt of his gun. Deputy Miller shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Elara and Elias. This boy, Elara continued, her voice clear, resonant in the damp morning air. He calls me Ma. A hush fell. Brody's eyes widened slightly. Miller looked confused. Even Carson, the silent deputy, seemed taken aback. It wasn't a direct claim of motherhood. Not in the eyes of the law. It was something else. A truth of the heart, thrown down like a gauntlet. He's a child, Elara said, her gaze sweeping over the 3 men. He's lost his mother. He needed comfort. He found it here. Brody recovered quickly. That don't make him yours. And it don't make Thorn innocent. He turned back to Elias. Thorn, you gonna hide behind a woman and a boy? Elias stepped forward, pushing Silas gently behind him. I hide from no one, Sheriff. I told you, I have done no wrong. The men who accuse me fear the truth I speak. We'll sort out the truth back in town, Brody said, pulling out a pair of manacles. You're coming with us. He started towards Elias. Silas cried out, a small, terrified sound. No! Elara moved. Fast. She stepped directly into Brody's path, her arms slightly spread, a small, determined barrier. You will not take them. Brody stopped, surprised by her sudden, fierce defiance. Ma'am, step aside. This ain't your fight. They are on my land. They are under my protection. They have become my concern. Her voice didn't tremble. The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried the weight of an unshakable conviction. This is my farm, my home, and while they are here, they are part of it. Miller licked his lips. Sheriff, Brody glared at Elara. Are you obstructing justice, ma'am? Because that's a serious charge. I am protecting what is mine, Elara stated. It was a gamble, a huge one. She had no weapon, no authority but the moral kind. But she saw a flicker of something in Brody's eyes. Uncertainty, or perhaps a grudging respect for a stubborn woman standing her ground. He looked from her to Elias, then to the small, tear-streaked face of Silas peeking out from behind the preacher. The boy was looking at Elara, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. There are powerful men looking for Thorn, Brody said, his voice a low growl. Men who won't be as understanding as I'm trying to be. Then let them come, Elara said. They'll find me here. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats and possibilities. Brody stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered the manacles. He looked at his deputies. We'll check your story, Thorn. About the boy's mother. About these men you speak of. He turned back to Elara. This ain't over, ma'am. Not by a long shot. If he's lying, if that boy is truly stolen, we'll be back. And we won't be so polite. He gestured to his men. Let's go. They mounted their horses, their movements stiff with frustration. Brody gave Elara one last hard look. Then they wheeled their horses around and rode away, not back across the fields, but down the main road, a clear indication that they would be making inquiries. The hoofbeats faded into the damp air, leaving behind a silence more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of a battle narrowly averted, a truce declared but not yet peace. Alara stood on the porch, her body trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Her legs felt weak, as if they might buckle. She leaned against a porch post, taking deep, ragged breaths. Silas was the first to move. He ran to her, his small arms wrapping around her waist, his face buried in her skirt. He was sobbing, quiet, hiccuping cries. Ilara's hand came up to stroke his hair, her touch a little unsteady. "It's all right, Silas," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's all right now. They're gone." Elias approached slowly, his face etched with a mixture of gratitude and deep concern. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze on Ilara, searching. "You shouldn't have done that, Ilara," he said, his voice heavy. "You've put yourself in danger for us." She looked at him over Silas's head. A faint, weary smile touched her lips. "Seems I'm getting rather used to danger around here." She straightened, Silas still clinging to her. "They said they'd be back." "They will," Elias affirmed, his expression grim. "Men like Brody, they don't like to be defied. And the ones I ran from, they have long arms." "Then we'll be ready for them," Ilara said, a new resolve hardening her voice. She looked around her small farm, at the mended porch, the somewhat tidier chicken coop, the barn that had become a sanctuary. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And now, it seemed, so were they. Silas finally looked up, his face tear-streaked, but his eyes shining with an almost unbearable relief and a dawning adoration. "You saved us, Ma." He said it with such simple, profound conviction. Ma. This time, the word didn't jolt her. It settled into her heart, warm and right, like a missing piece finally clicking into place. She knelt, bringing herself to his eye level. "We saved each other, Silas." She glanced at Elias, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a bond forged in shared adversity, in unspoken understanding. The sun, finally breaking through the dissipating storm clouds, cast long shadows, painting the wet earth in hues of gold and amber. The air smelled clean, washed, new. The farm, which had felt so barren and silent for so long, seemed to breathe with a tentative hope. Ilara knew this was not an ending. It was, perhaps, a new beginning, fraught with uncertainty, but a beginning nonetheless. The whispers in town would likely grow louder, more insistent. The threat of Brody's return, and the faceless men Elias fled, loomed large. But something fundamental had shifted within her. The walls she had built around her heart, stone by careful stone over 3 years of grief and solitude, had not just been breached, they had been willingly dismantled. She had chosen them. This fragile, unconventional family, born of desperation and circumstance, now bound by courage and a fierce, protective love. She stood, pulling Silas gently to his feet. "Come on," she said, her voice regaining its usual quiet strength. "Let's get some breakfast. There's work to be done." And as they walked towards the house, the small boy's hand held tight in hers, the tall preacher following a step behind. The farm felt less like a place of endings, and more like a place where things, unexpectedly, wonderfully, might just begin again. The quiet triumph was not loud, not grand, but it resonated in the steady beat of her own heart, a rhythm she hadn't realized she'd missed so dearly. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over the farm. It wasn't the heavy silence of Ilara's solitude, nor the tense quiet of impending confrontation. It was a watchful quiet, a working quiet, imbued with a fragile sense of peace, yet underscored by an awareness that their respite might be temporary. Sheriff Brody did not return immediately, but his threat hung in the air like the lingering humidity after the storm. Ilara found herself glancing towards the road more often, her ears attuned to the distant sound of horses or wagons. But life had to continue. The chickens still needed feeding, the meager garden tending, the constant small repairs attended to. Now, however, these tasks were shared. Elias, though still reserved about his past, proved to be a capable hand around the farm. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived with little waste. His strength, slowly returning. He fixed the stubborn latch on the smokehouse door, reinforced a weakening section of the barn roof, and even managed to coax a slightly better flow from the reluctant well pump. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a steady masculine energy that Alara hadn't realized she'd missed until it was there. Silas was her constant shadow, but a more confident one now. The fear that had clung to him like a shroud was slowly receding, replaced by a boyish curiosity and an eagerness to help. He chattered more, asking questions about the chickens, the plants, the way the clouds moved. He still called her Ma, the word now as natural and unquestioned as the sunrise. Alara found herself responding to it without hesitation, the initial shock replaced by a warmth that spread through her like summer sunshine. She taught him how to identify wildflowers, how to listen for the call of the quail in the tall grass. She showed him the faded photograph of Jonah, tucked away in her keepsake box. "This was Jonah," she said, her voice soft. "He built this farm with me." Silas looked at the smiling man in the picture, his head tilted. "He looks kind." "He was," Alara affirmed, a gentle ache in her chest. Speaking of Jonah no longer felt like tearing open a fresh wound. It was a memory shared, a legacy passed on, however informally. The town remained a distant entity. No one came calling after Mrs. Henderson's visit and the sheriff's departure. Alara imagined the whispers were louder now, more speculative. Perhaps they thought her mad, or bewitched, or simply foolish. She found she cared less and less what they thought. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of her farm, but within those boundaries, it had become infinitely richer. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, Elias spoke, his voice low. "I should not have stayed, Alara. I've brought my troubles to your door." Alara watched Silas, who was trying to catch a firefly in a jar, his face alight with focused joy. "Your troubles found their way here, Elias, just like you did." She turned to him. "And maybe we needed some trouble to stir things up." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "This place was asleep," she said, struggling for words. "I was asleep. Now," she gestured vaguely at the quiet scene, at Silas's happy shouts. "Now it feels awake." Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he murmured, more to himself than to her. It wasn't a platitude. It felt like a genuine, weary acknowledgement of life's strange turns. The open loop of Jonah's fate still existed, a quiet hum beneath the surface. She would never know for certain if he ran or if the river took him, but the sharp edges of that uncertainty had softened. Her waiting had ended, not with his return, but with the arrival of others. The farm was no longer just a monument to what was lost. It was becoming a testament to what could be found, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The dry, silent farm still bore the scars of drought and neglect, but now, small signs of change were emerging. A few more vegetables pushed through the soil, encouraged by diligent watering. The chickens seemed to lay with more enthusiasm, or perhaps it was just Alara's perception that had changed. The fear of Brody's return, of the men Elias fled, remained, but it was a fear faced together. And in that shared vulnerability, there was a profound strength. She was no longer a solitary woman on a desolate farm. She was Alara. She was, to a small, persistent boy, Ma. And she was, alongside a quiet preacher, a guardian of this fragile, unexpected sanctuary. The future was a path obscured by mist, but for the first time in a very long time, Alara felt ready to walk it, not with resignation, but with a quiet, steady hope. And so, they lived, day by day, in the rhythm of the changing seasons, a small, unlikely constellation against the vast, indifferent sky. They were a testament, perhaps, to the stubborn resilience of the human heart, to its capacity to find love and purpose in the most barren of landscapes. And perhaps that is all any of us can truly ask for, a place to call home, and someone to share the silence, and the storms, and the surprising, tenacious beauty of an awakened life. You see, The heart, much like the parched earth, can lie dormant for a long, long time, waiting for an unexpected rain, a chance encounter, a small hand reaching out in the darkness to bring forth blooms you thought had withered long ago.